This video is brought to you by our amazing supporters over at Patreon.
Hey everyone, it's Ben from Board to Bits, and in this video we're going to start our communication between Unity and our MySQL database by going into our registration page and creating user accounts that are stored in the database. So to start, we're in our main menu page where we're going to create a link between this register button and the register menu that we have. So I'm going to create a new C# script, and I'm going to call this main menu. I'm going to add this to the canvas. And we're going to open this up in Visual Studio. We're not going to need our start or update methods in here. However, we're going to create a new public method called goToRegister. And we're actually going to use the scene management namespace up here to save us some time. So we're going to say using Unity engine.scene management so that we can quickly get access to the scene manager class. And we're going to say scene manager dot load scene. We're going to use scene 1. This is going to be pertinent when we go into our build settings and kind of set up the order that our scenes are in. That's actually all we need to do inside of here for right now. So that's all set. And now we can jump back to Unity. In fact, let's go to that build menu right now just so that we make sure that we have this all in line. Go build settings. And what we're going to do is we're going to add the scenes that we have here. The first one I'm going to add is main menu. So this is actually index 0. The next one will be the register menu. So that's index 1, and that's why loading scene 1 will get us to the register menu. We'll add the login menu, and then finally the game. Oops. Finally the game. So order does matter here, and keep those indices in mind. So with our build settings taken care of, let's go to our register button, add a event, or add a method to the onClick event here. We're going to drag in the entire canvas object here, and we're going to change the function to main menu goToRegister. So now that button will bring us to the registration scene. We can save this and now actually go to a registration scene and set up the C# script we need in here. So in here, I'm going to create a new C# script, call this registration, and then add it to the canvas in this scene. Click and drag this onto here, and we'll open this up in Visual Studio. Once again, we can delete our start and update functions, and we're going to add a few public variables here. However, we need one new namespace in here as well. Using Unity engine.ui. We're going to be using those input fields, and we need to access the information within them, so we need the UI namespace to access those particular classes. We'll say public input field name field and public input field password field. We'll also add a public button reference for our submit button, and those will work there. Now, how communicating with the web works is we're going to be using what's called the www class, which is Unity's kind of pre-built-in class to communicate and get information from URLs online, or from websites online via their URLs. As we're doing this, though, we can use them as what are called coroutines so that we can kind of send out that request. It might take a few seconds for it to come back, and we can continue running the game until that comes back. So in order to do that, though, we can't actually do a public coroutine call and make use of it. We need to kind of create a middleman class, or a middleman method, rather. So we're going to say public void call register. And all that this is going to do is this is going to start a coroutine, which we're about to write, called register. Oops. You may try to autocomplete that on you. Make sure that this one is just called register. And then we're going to say down here, we're going to have an I enumerator. This one does not need to be public, and it's going to be called register. So in here, what's essentially going to happen is we're going to make a call to a particular URL, which could be anywhere on the internet. In this case, we're going to be using the PHP scripts that we're going to write inside of that document root that MAMP is using. So in order to access that, you simply access it like we did that MAMP splash page using just instead of saying, HTTP and any sort of URL, you just have to say HTTP localhost. So we're going to write that first. We're going to say www, so that's is the type of class. We're going to create this sort of a request object, and we'll just call it www as well, equals a new www, and then we have to pass in the URL. So in this case, it's going to be, and it's a string, so we'll do quotes, HTTP : / localhost, and then we're actually going to give it a couple of directories here. We're going to do one directory, which is going to be, we'll call this SQL Connect, which is what I'm going to create a folder called that inside of the htdocs root folder. And then I'm going to say register.php, which is going to be the name of the PHP file we create. This is technically all you need to access a page and get information from it. From there, what we can do is we can say yield return www, and what that will do is that will actually tell Unity, just kind of put this on the back burner, and then once we get the information back, we'll run the rest of the code. And then we can finally say at this point, once we get that information, we can actually do some stuff with it. We'll see that www actually has a property called text, which returns the text of the web page we've gotten. Now, if this was a web browser, we would have a lot of the tags of HTML, body, possibly some header tags and things like that. However, for a PHP file, we can simply return just some pretty plain and basic text, which is how we really can use the information we're getting. So all we're really going to be passing is, typically speaking, a number, which is sort of an error code, or 0 if there's no errors, and then whatever relevant information we want to be passed back. So in this case here, what we can do is we can say if www.text equals 0, meaning if all we've passed back is the single character of 0, meaning there were no errors, then we know that this worked. And we're going to debug.log user created successfully, so we have sort of a visual that this actually did happen. And then we can simply say Unity engine.scene management.scene manager load scene 0. So we'll go back to the main menu once we've successfully created a user. Else, if we got something other than 0, that means that there was some sort of error. We can say something to the effect of debug.log user creation failed error number, and then add whatever that text is. And so we'll tell our PHP scripts that they need to, when there is a problem, return an error number at very least, and maybe some description as to what went wrong or where the going wrong happened. Lastly, we're going to add one more public method in here. It's going to be a public void called verify inputs. And the reason for this is that a lot of times you're going to want the ability to tell your forms that they should only be accepted under certain conditions. A lot of times you'll see where websites will require you to have at least a certain number of characters, or you have to have certain types of characters in your password, or you're not allowed to have certain types of characters, things like that. We're going to do this pretty simply right now. We're just going to be checking for the length of these names. But basically what's going to happen is if the name doesn't meet the name and the password don't meet a certain length requirement, we're not going to allow you to click on that submit button. So we'll say submit button dot interactable equals, and then we're going to do a couple of checks. We're going to say name field dot text dot length, meaning what's been written into the name field. If that is greater than or equal to 8, meaning it needs to be at least 8 characters, and we need to make sure that the password field dot text dot length is also less than or greater than or equal to 8 characters. If both of those things are true, then then interactable will be true, and we can click that submit button. If either of them is false, this will not be interactable. We won't be able to click that button. So it's just a way of kind of ensuring that any information we pass to the PHP page has at least been validated here. And again, there's a lot more you can do to validate these things, but for right now, we're keeping it pretty simple. Now, the other thing that we need to do within this code is that we can't just go to the register page and say, hey, someone wants to register. We need to pass the information of who is registering. And so in order to do that, we're going to use an additional part of this www call, which is to pass in a form as well. Forms are actually, you work with them a lot when you're online. Anytime that you enter your username and password onto a website, or you fill out, say, a credit card information or shipping information on a shopping cart, chances are it's using a form, and it's what's called posting that to the server, which is kind of a little bit more secure way to pass information to the server, and then that information is being used by, chances are, either a PHP or some other back-end code to run the request that you're making. So we can create one of those. Instead of actually having a form that you have to fill out on a web page, we can create one in code here by saying www form, and we'll just call this form, equals a new www form. So right now we're just creating this empty form, and then we're going to add a couple fields to it. We're going to say form.addField, and when you add a field, you have to give it two things. You have to give it a name, and then you have to give it the value that's inside of it. So we're going to say, the first one we're just going to call, we'll just call it name, because that's going to be the name that's passing in. These names will be important though. Whatever label we give them is going to be important for the PHP side, so do remember that this field is called name, and then I'm going to pass into it nameField.text, whatever the player has typed in there, and then we're going to say form.addField password, and here we're going to pass in passwordField.text. And then lastly, we need to actually make sure that we pass this in as another parameter here. So we can pass in the URL we're sending to, and then comma, and you'll see there's a few options here, but one of them is you can pass in the whole form as its own parameter, so we'll say form. With all that, let's go back to Unity. Now in here, we can hook up our various properties here. So the name field, we're going to go in, and we have to go all the way to this name input field, because this is the actual input field object. So we'll drag in name input field here. We will drag in the password input field, and then finally our register button. I also do want to go into the register button and make sure it's not interactable to start, so I'm just going to check that off here. And that will just ensure that when we first start up on the scene and we don't have anything in the name or the password fields, we're not able to register right away. It won't be until we type in at least 8 characters in both fields that we'll able to actually click that button and register. So from here now, we need to actually pass this information to that PHP file. We need to create that PHP file so that there's somewhere to pass it to. So I'm going to save this scene, and I'm going to jump into Sublime Text, and we're going to get into the wild world of coding in PHP. So what we're going to do here, this is just pretty much the startup. When you start up in Sublime Text, you're going to see something like this. I'm going to go File, I'm going to open a folder, and inside of my MAMP htdocs folder, I'm going to create a new folder here. And I'm going to call this SQL Connect, I believe I had called it. I can quickly double check in my Visual Studio Code. Yes, SQL Connect. And then I'm going to select this folder. And what opening a folder does is it actually creates the folder inside of your sidebar here so that you can easily work with it. You don't have to keep jumping back to the File Explorer. With that, I'm now going to right-click here and say New File. And this is going to create a new untitled file here that potentially will exist inside of this folder. What I'll do is I will quickly hit Control-Shift-S to save. And inside of here, I'm going to save this as register.php. And it is important to append that at the end so that way Sublime Text knows what kind of file you're working with. We'll hit Save. And now this exists as this PHP file inside of SQL Connect. So the first thing we need to do when we are creating a PHP file is we need to encapsulate all of this inside of PHP code. Technically speaking, you can also use HTML in a PHP file. It just kind of lets the server know that, oh, there's some code on here that can be run. In our case here, though, we're going to be working purely in PHP. We're not going to have any HTML in these files. So to do that, we're going to do a less than sign or an angle bracket, question mark PHP. Then I'm going to hit enter a few times and then do another question mark and an end bracket. And this means that everything inside of here is running PHP code. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a connection to our SQL database. And we do this by creating a variable to store that connection in. So I'm going to do that. Anytime you create a variable in PHP, you do a $sign first and then give it a name. And so we're going to say just con for connection. You don't have to specify the type. PHP is not strongly typed like C# is, so you can just give it a name and PHP will figure out what's supposed to be stored inside of it. We're going to say equals, and then you're going to do a method call, which is MySQL and the I is for it's sort of the new version. There were these old MySQL functions, and now they're MySQL which is sort of like the improved versions of them. And we're going to use this MySQL connect. We're going to end the line with a semicolon, and we're going to need to pass in a few things here. The first thing you pass in is the location of the database. So in this case, it's going to be just localhost, but this would be where you would put in the URL or the relative position of the database. Next, we're going to pass in the username. So some user that has access. In this case, we're going to just use that root that MAMP comes with. However, if you have your own custom credentials, this is where you'd put them in. So we will say root here, root for the username, and then root for the password. Now, yes, this is putting your password in plain text in this file, but the important thing is that PHP files exist strictly on the server, and they exist on the back end like completely invisible. Even if this were to get loaded as an HTML page, you would never actually see the PHP. It would get kind of scrubbed before it got sent to the browser. So you can put this in with confidence that as long as your server is secure, this information is going to be secure. So that's why this is kind of an allowable, you can hard code your username and password here rather than doing it inside of your Unity code, which technically someone could, once they've downloaded your code and they have your game on your computer, they could pick through and potentially find this information. Lastly, we need to put in the name of the database that we made. Let me quickly double check what I had called the database that we're working with here. And this one is the database. And remember, this is the database, not the table. Database is Unity Access. So we'll use that name, and we'll say here, quote, Unity Access. PHP isn't super strict about using single quotes versus double quotes, so you may see them kind of used interchangeably. Mostly what it's important for are situations, and we'll see a couple of these as we're making our SQL queries, of closing and opening. They obviously have to be the same on both ends, and you might start alternating them so that you can put quotes into something without ending the quotes of the string itself. So this will now attempt to create a connection. Next thing we want to do is we want to check that connection happened. And so we'll say if MySQL connect ERRNO, and then parentheses, which means check, did any errors come up? If there were 0 errors, this will come up as false. If there were any number other than 0, this will come up as true. So if this is true, meaning that there were some errors, then what we're going to do is we're going to do what's called echo. And echo is kind of like debug log. It's what's going to be kind of printed. It's the text that's going to go into that www when it returns. So in this case, we're going to echo the number 1, meaning an error happened. This is not 0. An error did happen. And I'm just going to mark here just for my own documentation. I'm going to say error code number 1 equals connection failed. And then we're going to say exit, meaning kind of like return. We don't need to do any of the other code. However, if there were no errors, we can continue on. And the next thing I'm going to do here is now I'm going to get the information that we passed from Unity, and I'm going to store it in a couple of variables so that they're more easily accessible here in PHP. So I'm going to create a username variable, and I'm going to create a password variable. Now, how we get these is, remember that we stored these pieces of information in a form, and then, like I said, we post it to the server. And so we can actually get these in PHP using this kind of global variable called post. So we'll say username equals, and then $_. So this is sort of like saying this is a constant thing that always exists. Post, meaning I'm getting what's been posted in that form. I'm going to quickly double check that my name is labeled name, my password is labeled password. So we'll go back here and we'll say post, and then we're going to use angle brackets and get name. So that will access that name field from the form. Likewise, we'll say password equals, and then again $_post password. And so now we have these both. We could just as easily use these, but it's just a little bit cleaner to be able to just type in quickly, you know, a single variable rather than this sort of a kind of array call style of gathering that information. So next we're going to double check to see if this name already exists in our database. Because if someone has already taken the name, we don't want to allow our player to use that name as well, because that could cause confusion. So we'll say check if name exists. And we'll do this by running what's called a query. And this is where we're actually going to start using what's called the query language. SQL is, the QL is query language. And so we'll say, we're going to create a new variable here as well. I'm going to call this name check query. And this is going to be equal to, use double quotes, and now we're going to start, now this string inside of these quotes is actually going to be written in that query language, not in PHP. And so when you want to get a row from a table, what you do is you write select, meaning select any rows of this table. And so, and the particular column we want right now is just the name column. So we'll say select the name column from, and then we're going to get the table. And I want to double check again here. The table is named players. So we're going to say select name from players. And then we want to give it this special kind of condition. We only want rows that match the name of our username. Hopefully it's coming back 0. There are no names that match, but if there is one, we want it to come back in this query. So we're going to say select name from players where name equals, and this is where we need to start using those kind of alternating quotes, because I'm going to put a single quote here. And then we're going to concatenate this string. You've probably done this potentially in Unity before, where you say like a string plus a variable plus another string, et cetera, et cetera. In PHP, we do this with periods. So we're going to say dot, and then we're going to pass in that username, and then dot, and then we need double quotes, a single quote. So this single quote closes this single quote. And then we're going to end all this with a semicolon for the, so this is all one line of a query. So with that query written out now, and stored in this variable, we can now actually make the query itself. We're going to say another variable just called the actual name check now is going to equal a MySQLi query, and we're going to pass in the connection. So it knows this is the database connection that we're querying. And we're going to pass in this query. So we'll say name check query. And it's going to run this. Now here we have, we're going to check in the same line now if this query worked. If for some reason this query didn't work, we're going to say or die, which die basically means the same thing as exit, except that we're also it's going to pass out some information. So here we're going to say die or die, and then we're going to pass out the number, let's say 2 here. And in this case, and then we'll close this off, but we'll say error code number 2, name check query failed. And we can actually put this information in here because we're only checking if the value is 0, then we don't have any error information, so we'll just put in the 0 character. However, for these, we could actually say 1 and then say connection failed. And then for this one, we can say 2 name check query failed, so that we're getting a little bit more information. When this gets logged, if an error gets logged to our console, we can see, oh, this is the line where there's an issue. Makes it easier to debug what's going on. Now we're going to check to see if this name actually exists. Did this return any rows, or did it just return 0 rows? So we'll say if MySQLi num rows, and we'll pass it in the result of the name check that we just did, If this is greater than 0, that means that there is at least one username that matches the username being requested, so we can't allow it to register. If that is the case, then we're going to echo 3. In this case, name already exists. Error code number 3. Name exists, cannot register. And then we're again going to exit. Again, in the case of die up here, we don't have to also specify exiting because the die does the exit and passes in the information. We could, in theory, put dies here too, but we'll just do it this way for now. Kind of see the both ways that this can work. And then, assuming all of this has passed, so we connected successfully, there isn't a duplicate name, now we can actually add the user to the table. And this is going to be a two-step process. The first thing we need to do is we actually need to convert the player's password into that salt and hash that we created in our database. And the reason for that is we don't want to store our password as plain text in our database. What that would do is that would essentially mean that if someone broke into our database, they could see all of everyone's passwords and use them right away. Salting and hashing is a means of both preventing them from doing that, and that the hashing means that they can't just immediately put in some information and get their password. The salting means that they can't use what are called lookup tables, which are ways that hackers and other bad actors will use to quickly break through encrypted passwords and figure out what they are. So using these two steps, what we're going to do is we're going to first off create a salt. I'm going to say salt equals, and we're going to pass in a kind of cryptic line of code here, which is going to be first the $, and I'm putting this with a slash in front of it. This just means specifically write a $, don't think of it as one of these variables, because PHP obviously uses $signs to mean a lot of things. So this is just kind of a way of saying, actually write a $sign. I'm not trying to do anything special with this. Then we're going to say the number 5, then we're going to say another /$, and then rounds equals 5,000. What we're using here is called SHA 256 encryption, which is one of the more secure means of encrypting things still. And so what this does for us is it's going to run through like 5,000 rounds of kind of shifting these characters around and coming up with this really long and garbled mess of code. Next, we're going to do another /$, and this, the $5 up here is kind of the indicator that this is going to be SHA 256. And then, like I say, this rounds is actually optional, and you can reset if you wanted less rounds to run, which would make this run a little bit faster. You could set a lower number, or if you wanted it more secure, you could set a higher number, but it will take more time. And then from there, we're going to concatenate some kind of additional line. We can do whatever we want. In this case, I might just write something goofy in here. I'm going to write steamed hams, because what this needs ultimately as well is to be a 16-character salt. And so what I'm going to use is actually the player's username as part of it, just to be able to kind of randomize it a little bit. There are obviously much more secure ways of doing this, but for right now, this is just a way to get a different salt for each person. But then this is going to kind of guarantee us that we have enough other letters to make the 16-character salt. So steamed hams dot, and then we'll pass in the username. You do not want to pass in the password here, because obviously this will actually be visible in the database, and so you don't want to see that there. And then finally, we need to add in one last slash there. So that creates the salt. Next, we're going to actually create the hash, which is this combination of encrypting the password with the salt. So we'll say this equals crypt password and salt. Again, this is not especially using like a single kind of static part of the salt here and that, this is not the most secure way to do this. And you could do an entire course. In fact, there are entire degrees on information security. This is just kind of getting you into it. I didn't want to do this series without any security at all, given the kind of environment that we live in these days of privacy and security. But this is not by the end all be all of security. So I encourage you, if you are using this sort of a system, to do some additional research and find out about better ways of securing things. But this is a good way to at least get you started. Lastly, we're now going to make the query that actually puts the information into the database. So we're going to say insert user query. And this is still called a query, even though it's actually like kind of doing something. It's not requesting information. Every interaction you have with the database is called a query. We're going to say insert into players, and then we say which columns we're actually populating right now. Because remember, our ID column is going to be automatically populated. We don't need to worry about that. And our score defaults to 0, which is chances are what we want. We're not going to, unless we're giving people free points for some reason, and we can fix that later on. Right now, all we really care about is the username, the hash, and the salt. So we'll say that here. We're going to say name, hash, and salt. And I do just want to quickly again confirm. Nope, I hadn't called this one username, so I'm glad I checked that. That would have caused an error here. Username, hash, salt. And then continuing inside of the quotes here, we're going to say values. And now we're going to actually establish which values we're passing in. And for these, because all of these are strings, we do need quotes around them. If they were just numbers, we wouldn't need the quotes. But so here I'm going to put a single quote again. And then I'm going to add in username. Then we'll do another quote, comma, quote. So these two quotes here are encapsulating the username. This quote is going to encapsulate the hash. And then we'll do again, double quote, single quote. So these two quotes here are encapsulating hash, comma, starting a new quote, salt. And then finally, we will do one final single quote, a single parenthesis to close off this values parentheses here, and then a semicolon to end the line. Likewise, we also need a semicolon to end our actual line outside of the quotes here. So this whole string here has its own semicolon at the end, and then our actual line of command to create this query has a semicolon. And then we need to actually execute the query again. So we'll say MySQL query. And in this case, we're going to pass in, again, the connection to our database, and then our insert user query. Or if this for some reason failed, maybe we have something mistyped in here, or something has just gone awry, or will die, and we will say, in this case, for insert player query failed. So once again, doesn't tell us exactly what went wrong, but at least gives us some level of information about something that went wrong. Error code number 4, insert query failed. And I'm kind of doubling up on the documentation there, but more information is better than less. So lastly, if we've gotten through all this, we didn't die here, we've managed to connect, we've managed to don't have a duplicate name, we've successfully inserted into the table, then we can just simply echo the single digit, the single character of 0. And that means that we've had a success. We're just passing back 0, kind of like we would in like when you're returning void, a method ran properly, all set. We're good to go. So with all of this, hopefully everything has been typed correctly. We will see, because now we can jump back. We've got this saved. We've got this saved in our SQL Connect folder, and we've got MAMP running here. So we've got our server running, and our server architecture and our database running. So I can jump back to Unity now, and what we should see here, I can even go back to our main menu, hit play, and if I click register, we go to our register screen, and now you'll notice here I cannot click register yet because I set it not to interactable. I can start typing in here, maybe I say BOA board to bits. That's about 11 characters, so that is within the requested amount. Likewise here, I can do some sort of password in here. You can just do password. Now for some reason at this point, oh, I know why. We do need to make sure that these, I don't think we actually assigned any of our events for these. So for our two fields here, name input field, we want to make sure that every single time we edit, I'm going to say every time a value is changed in here, I'm going to drag the canvas in, go to our registration, and verify inputs. The same will happen for our password input field. Canvas, registration, verify inputs, and that's on the on value changed. And then lastly, for our register button, we are going to add the canvas with the registration, and we're going to call register. Hey guys, so a couple of quick things to double check before we run our registration page here. The first is that you want to make sure that all of your lines of code have the semicolons at the end of them, particularly the ones where you're creating the queries, because you'll notice that you do have one in the query itself, but you do want to make sure you also have one in the PHP, otherwise your code will not run properly. The second thing I realized is that I misnamed these where I say select name and we're checking the name. This does not actually match my database or my tables columns. I have that named as username here, so I do want to make sure that I change both of these to select username from players where username equals, and then we're checking the variable that we have posted. So with those, we should now be all set to jump back to Unity. We can hit play, and if I go to register, and then I type in a name such as board to bits, helps if I spell it, and then in our password here, I can just type in whatever. I'll just type password for right now, and we hit register. We see that the user was created successfully. So if I go back to my database here now, and if I go to browse the players table, we see that board to bits has been added. We see that I have a salt here, which is the salt that is used for the password itself. And again, this is kind of in plain text here. We see steamed hams, we see my full name. We also see the hash here, which is a length of 75 characters, and it includes the salt, or at least part of the salt to start, and then it starts going into this very random code. And this, or these very random characters, I should say. And this is all just to, this is what kind of keeps your password from being plainly visible now. What instead is going to happen is we're going to have to check against encrypting using the same salt to see if the hashes end up matching. So your password is never stored in plain text anywhere. We've got our username stored. The ID is 1 because we've just started auto-incrementing and you've started with just 1. And the score is by default 0 because that's what we established there. So if I were to go back here now and hit play and try to register again, and try to register as board to bits, and then type in a password, I can just type in whatever for a password and hit register. We see here, user creation failed, error number 3, name already exists. So that error is being thrown back to us. We've kind of established and given some details as to what that is. We could even have our, we could have a prompt appear here or something saying that so that the player can see it as well. But it is that actual communication from us sending this information to the database and the database coming back and saying that name already exists, and PHP sending this error code so that we can work with it. So that covers registering. In our next video, we're going to get into a little bit more advanced ways of parsing this information so then we can actually access our user's account and update it as we play our game. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.